Thank you, Senator. Wow, really, really powerful. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back a man who has won the Lifetime Achievement Award twice, Tony Perkins.
How's it going so far? All right, let me make sure you can hear me. How's it going so far? All right, we're gonna shift gears a little bit now. We're gonna introduce to you our next guest, who is one of the nation's most popular and informative radio talk show hosts. Now, Sean Hannity has nicknamed him the Great One. And I will tell you what, and for good reason. He is not only a keen commentator on the issues of the day, but he is one of the top constitutional lawyers in America today. He served as a top advisor to several of the cabinet members in President Ronald Reagan's administration. He's also a best-selling author. His latest book lays out a path to restore America's founding principles. It's entitled The Liberty Amendments. Please help me welcome, with a good values voter welcome, Mark Levin. Well, I get to turn the tables a little bit now. I'm going to interview Mark. He's normally on the radio doing the interview, asking the questions. Now I get to ask the Great One the questions. Now, let me just start with this. Let's start with the new book, The Liberty Amendments. I've read it.
Don't we get a drink? We're sitting on these bar stools here. I don't drink, but anyway. Yeah.
I'll get you some apple juice.
There you go.
All right. The book, The Liberty Amendments, I mean, the timing of this could not be better when you look at where America is at. This is a pathway forward, and what you're proposing here is some fundamental changes to our Constitution, not to change it progressively, as the left would say, simply restoring it.
What I'm proposing is that we embrace the Constitution, we embrace our history, that we listen to George Mason and Madison and Franklin and the others, and take our country back. That's what I'm proposing. Now today, how come I don't get any hecklers? Now today, the problem is that the Constitution is not adhered to. Today, the problem is that one justice on the Supreme Court can amend the Constitution. Today, the problem is the President of the United States defies the Constitution. Today, the problem is the United States Congress passes laws that it doesn't have the authority to pass. Today, the problem is we have a massive bureaucracy that kicks out 3,000 laws a year without any checks and balances whatsoever. So when people say to me, what do you want to do, change the Constitution? Hell no, I want to embrace the Constitution.
Mark, you have been a frequent guest here at the Values Voter Summit over the last 8 years that we've had this. Would you have envisioned 5 years ago, 6 years ago, maybe even 4 years ago, that we would be at the point that we're in our nation as it pertains to the ignoring of the constitutional boundaries of what this administration is doing?
Yes, and it's going to get worse. And it's going to get worse because it feeds on itself. We are unmoored from the rule of law. And so the President of the United States can say brazenly, and people barely blink, that if Congress doesn't act, he will. These are the statements of soft tyranny. That's what that is. When Congress says they're going to pass omnibus bills, and they pass them in the dark of night, Obamacare, and we, the people, don't even get an opportunity to read it in advance, that is called tyranny. When the bureaucracy spits out rules that shut down our coal mines and shut down pipelines and shut down our fisheries, even though Congress hasn't agreed to act, that's called tyranny. When the Supreme Court of the United States overturns votes in California or rewrites our statutes in this country, that's called tyranny. So what are we going to do about it? That's the question, and that's why I wrote it.
And let's talk about that answer. How do you actually propose something in this book that heretofore you were not supportive of?
That's good. I propose that we look at the Constitution to find the answer to what's going on in this country. We don't have to invent it. We don't need abstractions. We don't have to make it up. And it's in the Constitution. And George Mason said, and he was right, that when Congress turns oppressive, and what he meant was this new federal government, that the people have to have recourse short of violence. And he said that recourse is, this is 2 days before the end of the Constitutional Convention, he said that recourse is in the people and the state legislatures, and that they need to be able to go to the state legislatures, and the state legislatures collectively, 2/3, can have a meeting called a convention, not a constitutional convention, a convention to propose amendments to all the other states, just as if Congress meets to propose amendments to the states. And that is how we return to a constitutional republic, which, folks, we simply do not have today.
So the key here is, one of the keys, is returning a focus to the states, which in many ways have just become the lackeys for the federal government in terms that this administration expects the states to carry out its orders, where it really should be reversed.
You realize the states have less influence in our government than like LULAC or the AFL-CIO or whatever they are. And the fact is that under our constitutional system, it's the federal government that has limited defined powers, and the states have plenary authority. But obviously that doesn't happen today, does it? Now, some of you come from blue states. I apologize that you're in these blue states. I refuse to live in a dark blue state, but some of you live in dark blue states, and you're saying, well, this is great for those of you who are in purple states and red states, and my answer to you is this. America is a blue state right now, and the only way to address this is to find 34 state legislatures, and to take the time to do it. It took us a century to get here, and so it may take us 20 or 30 years to get out of this. But we have no options. This is the only option. It's us in the state legislatures, and the state legislatures collectively have enormous power. Enormous power. Not the governors, they're not involved. Not the state courts, they're not involved. I don't care if no senator or no member of Congress supports this. We bypass them. That's the entire purpose of this process. When you watch the Senate floor and you see a handful of conservatives defending this nation against Obamacare, and they are under brutal assault in their own party, something is wrong. When Ted Cruz and Mike Lee and Rand Paul are the exception, something is wrong in that party. And I do not believe that Washington intends to reform itself. Just see it, what's going on right now. What are they fighting over? Really, they're fighting over nothing. We have a $17 trillion fiscal operating debt that's growing by $1 trillion every year. We have over $90 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Not a darn thing they're doing up there is going to change that trajectory. So what are we going to do? Surrender to this? Well, we have to stand up for ourselves, and the way we stand up for ourselves is in the state legislatures. One at a time, patiently but aggressively, we take back our country.
With the focus being on the states and the pathway forward that you've laid out in the Liberty Amendments, which, by the way, is available here at the bookstore, you've got to be encouraged by what you've seen happen in the states in the last few years. I mean, there are good trends at the state. When you look at what's happening here in Washington as the backdrop, that is discouraging. But what's happening in the states is quite encouraging.
It's encouraging, and what's happening is a lot of the states are trying to resist in different ways that they can. but because what's happened in Washington, D.C., we don't really have checks and balances. What you're seeing going on right now, I can already tell you what's going to happen. The debt's going to go up. There's still going to be a massive yearly deficit. They'll throw us something like repeal of the medical tax or something like that, but it's going to keep moving in that direction because that's all they know, because the left knows that they run the country. And the Republicans basically support the status quo with some adjustment. That's about it. So we're stuck. If you think this top-down, authoritarian, centralized method that somehow we can fix this, I'm not saying don't stop fighting in these primaries and everything. Of course, fight everywhere and at every time. But fundamentally, at least for the last 100 years and certainly the last 80 years, what's happened is they've changed the system. So the social compact's been broken. So the Constitution is not honored. And so if they're not honoring the Constitution, what do we, who believe in constitutional republicanism, what do we do about it? And I'm just saying that the framers told us what to do about it if we seek to do it. Now, I accept that humans are imperfect. I accept that every institution in this country is imperfect. I accept that states are imperfect. But that's the genius of the federalism system. Power is dispersed. If you have one out-of-control state or 10 out-of-control states, there's still 40 more states. But if you have one out-of-control Supreme Court, one out-of-control Congress, and one out-of-control president, there's nowhere to go. And that's the problem. Unless we go back to the Constitution to save the Constitution. That's the answer.
Before we move on to some of the issues of the day, because I want to touch on the Obamacare issue and the standoff that's going on right now, I want to use this as an educational moment, because one of the proposals that you have in this pathway to restoring the Constitution is dealing with the United States Senate, and it goes back reversing what was done in amending the Constitution for direct election of senators. And I don't think people realize what impact that truly had on the whole balance of power in our country.
More than any part of our government, the framers spent time on Congress. There was an enormous debate over this, and they kept going back to it. Bicameral Congress. That was a proposal that was brought to Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention. That was pretty much agreed to, 2 houses of Congress. What would this one house do? What would this other house do? Well, they decided that obviously the House of Representatives, or the lower house, and it was called the lower house because in Philadelphia, the state legislature, the lower floor was the House, was where the Assembly met, and the upper floor was where the Senate met. So the lower house, the House of Representatives, they said, okay, ultimately this will be direct elections. It is the only part of our government that is popularly elected, directly elected, because they did not believe in pure democracy. They believed in unalienable, God-given rights that nobody could vote to take away from you. So they were fearful of pure majoritarianism and factionalism. So they said, all right, here's what we're going to do. They settled on the House every 2 years, as you're well aware, and the Senate. There was a great debate over the Senate. They didn't want another house. They thought that was kind of ridiculous. And the arguments were made that if the Senate was directly elected, then the states would go away, which they have. So they came up with a system where the state legislatures would appoint the senator. It wasn't perfect because some state legislatures, they'd have split parties, they'd be fighting, there wouldn't be a senator appointed. Particularly Delaware had problems. But all that can be fixed, as I propose in my reform amendment. But in 1913, the rise of the progressive movement, we got 2 amendments. We got the income tax, and we got the abolition of the Senate. The Senate, as originally established, doesn't exist. And I can tell you this, there's not a single state that voted to ratify the Constitution that would vote to ratify the Constitution today if we went back 200 and some years. They insisted on having a say in the national legislature. So today, John McCain will listen to LULAC, he'll listen to Andrea Mitchell, he'll listen to this one or that one, but he will not listen to the state legislature in Arizona. And in the old days, they would have withdrew him. Today, we're stuck with him. I'll give you another example. You look at Virginia. Virginia, 2 senators voted for Obamacare. The governor opposed it. The attorney general fought it in the courts, Cuccinelli. The state legislature voted to protect the citizens from Obamacare, and the 2 senators voted for it. Well, had we had what was originally in the Constitution rather than this progressive movement, those senators would have either voted against it or they would have been withdrawn. See, this is a constant effort at pushing at the centralization of government, the concentration of power. That's what Obamacare is about. That's what Dodd-Frank is about. That's what every single thing this Congress, President, and Supreme Court do is about. If you can tell me 3, 4, 5 examples in the last 25 years where they took steps to empower the people, where they took steps to preserve the sovereignty of the states, I'll give you $1,000. You won't find it. I've looked.
The bottom line there is that the state legislatures are important, and they could be the key to restoring the balance in our government and restoring the Constitution.
The state legislatures, acting collectively, have ultimate power. They can amend the Constitution by proposing amendments to themselves rather than waiting for Congress. As George Mason said, why would a tyrannical Congress propose amendments to control a tyrannical Congress? It's not going to happen. And I'm telling you, this Congress is not going to fix itself. And just voting for Republicans doesn't fix it. If you look at what happened under the prior administration, Bush had 6 years of a Republican Congress. They controlled the House, they controlled the Senate, they controlled the bureaucracy. What did we do? We massively expanded the debt, we massively expanded Medicare, we massively expanded central government control over local education. We never took steps to unravel what the left did. And this is what I mean. We are on this trajectory, and either we take steps over the next few years to address it, or we're done. And I'm not going to stand here like politicians and put a smiley face on this. I am telling you, as somebody who's been a conservative my entire life, who fought in the 76 and 80 primaries for Reagan, who served 8 years in the Reagan administration, who was chief of staff to the Attorney General of the United States, I am telling you that unless we rise up, take control of our state legislatures, and fix this thing on our own, it's not going to be fixed.
Well, Mark, let's talk about one of those issues that's front and center today. What brought us to this point where there is this showdown here in Washington between the GOP and the Obama administration, and that is Obamacare. Now, some have said, Republicans have said, well, we should just allow Obamacare to go into effect, and it'll drive the elections in 14 and 16, and then the Republicans will fix it.
See, this is how they think inside the Beltway. In other words, they don't want to do anything. In other words, they don't have any way to fix this, to stop it, to obstruct it, and they have no intention of doing it. And I'm here to tell you right now that Obamacare is here to stay with the current Republican leadership. It's not going anywhere. Oh, they'll tweak it here and there. Now, let's think about that. And I've heard this endlessly. It'll implode on its own. What government agency implodes on its own? It expands. And it gets more power. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough bureaucrats. We don't have enough authority. We don't have enough centralization of power. The problem, you see, isn't us, it's you. You're not behaving the way we expect you to behave in order for our programs to work. So nothing's going to implode except the entire society. That's going to implode one day because we can't handle this. That's number one. Number two, listen to that logic that they put out there. We're talking about real human beings here. They're losing their doctors. They're losing their health care. They're losing their jobs. Full-time jobs are going to part-time jobs. And I hear the Wall Street Journal editorial board talk about, well, put it in place, let it implode, then we'll win office. What? I say they've got it backwards. Let them implode, let us be free, and get rid of Obamacare.
To that point, you made reference to something earlier, that the Republicans usually just tweak on the margins. And so the idea that they would somehow repeal this after it's in place is without historical precedence.
I can't think of a single thing they've repealed. Can anybody? Seriously. I mean, I honestly can't think of a single thing that they have repealed. I talk about, let's look at the most recent Republican administration. They didn't repeal, they built. And many of the former staffers in that administration are the ones on TV and elsewhere trashing Ted Cruz and Mike Lee and Rand Paul and conservatives who are trying to deal with this, and trashing the Tea Party and conservative movement generally. So I think we have to accept, I know this is painful, I'm a Republican, I think we have to accept that the Republican Party today is not the Reagan Republican Party, it's not the Goldwater Republican Party, it is the status quo, neo-status Republican Party. Just look at their actions. When you have young men who won primaries against the establishment in Texas and Utah and Kentucky, standing up as the leaders in the United States Senate because the old bulls who've been there 30 years, 40 years, and so forth, will not act on our behalf. And then they turn all their firepower on these young men to trash them, to try and destroy them. They go to the New York Times. They go to whatever, wherever they have to go. This is simply unacceptable, and we need to make it clear to these politicians that it's unacceptable. But I'm also telling you that this is a battle over here, and we have a battle that we have to take on ourselves. It's our country, it's our Constitution, it's our private property, it's our individual sovereignty, and we stand for us.
You mentioned Ted Cruz. You mentioned Rand Paul, Mike Lee.
There are others, I can't remember.
And there are some in the House. I mean, actually in the House, the balance is there's almost at a tipping point where it's got to be driving John Boehner crazy to try to balance all these factions. But the elections of 2010, driven by Obamacare, a response to it, that's where you saw the balance shift back to the Republicans. 2012, while we lost in the White House, there was still a conservative ideological shift more to the right in the House. So it's amazing to me that people are screaming about those who are standing up to repeal Obamacare at this time of the CR and the debt ceiling. That's what those guys campaigned on and were elected for.
It amazes me how these people get elected to the Senate and the House. Are they missing something? I mean, Obamacare is despised, and it's not even implemented. It's already imploding. Pay attention, do something about it. But we only one half of one third. I think, you're only one half of one third. You know where the great statesmen come from? It's when they're in the minority, fighting the battles in order to overcome. If the battles were so easy, we wouldn't have battles, now would we? Whether it's politics or military operations or other things that go on here, we're looking for the statesmen. We're looking for the leaders, and there's precious damn few of them, to be quite frank about it. Obamacare is easy. The unions hate it. The senior citizens hate it. The young people hate it. We hate it. So who likes it? Washington likes it because they control us. They get our data. They tell us who we can see, who we can't see. Now we can't get in the computer. They're still going to tax us if we can't get into the computer. Look at what we've become. Look at what we are. We're French.
Mark, before we run out of time, I want to shift to another issue set that I think is prevalent today. You have a public interest law practice as well, where you defend people whose freedoms have been trampled by the government. Do you see a rising threat to the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech under this administration?
Well, listen, look at Obamacare. Obamacare is a direct assault on religious liberty under the First Amendment. There's no question about it. There are several dozen lawsuits challenging this. And, we pray come June, we all sit on the edge of our chairs and say, please, Supreme Court, please, rule, follow the Constitution. Please, see the First Amendment. We read it. Can you read it? And we pray to God, and we sit here breathlessly hoping, John Roberts, please, please. The hell? I'm just saying that the fact of the matter is, it's an unalienable right in the Declaration. And even if it wasn't in the Declaration, it's still an unalienable right. That's number one. Number two, There is a complete assault on religious liberty, and not just through Obamacare. It's in the public school system. So in other words, if you don't cleanse the public school system of references to religion, then somehow you're compelling people to be of one faith or another. That was not what was intended in the founding. So the answer is yes, religious liberty is under attack. More broadly, faith is under attack through the culture, through the government. And of course, the great reason is, if you read Marx, you understand why, because your religion has to be government.
Right.
And it's the politicians who are the false idols. So they come up with proposals for saving humanity and making us well and all these other things. So you don't need to go to church or synagogue or wherever and pray and that sort of thing. Just elect a liberal and your promises will be answered. Your prayers will be answered.
Yeah, but when they pass the offering plate, it's a lot bigger.
Yeah. They pass what's called a taking plate.
That's right.
Actually, they're lifting our wallets when we walk in the door there. Yeah.
We're as I said, we're about out of time, and I want to thank you, Mark, for coming here. I know you don't do a lot of public events because you've got your daily radio program, 2 hours every night from 6 to 8, right? 3. I get it delayed.
He gets it delayed.
I'm on radio at the same time. Do you listen to me?
I don't even listen to me.
Oh, okay.
No.
But I want to thank you for being here at the Values Voters Summit. And I want to tell you, I've got all of Mark's books on my shelf, and they're not just sitting there. I've read them. Now, I am cheap. I got the embargoed copy that you sent me back in August. But let me just say, he is one of the best authors in America today in terms of not just telling us what we want to hear, but telling us what we need to know and how we can go about fixing the problems in our nation. I highly recommend the Liberty Amendments. It's a great read, and it will be informative. And I want to leave you with kind of a softball.
Yeah.
Is it time for Americans to sit down and shut up, as this administration would want us to do, or is it time to stand up and speak out?
It's time for him to sit down and shut up. And it is never time for us to sit down and shut up. And I want to thank Tony for what he does, not just in convening this magnificent summit, what he does all year long. And we were all praying for you and your folks the other year when that nut job tried to come in here and shoot you and other people. That's number one. Number two, you're people of faith. You're people who believe in God. You're people who believe in your country and your Constitution. And I want to thank you because you are the army of patriots that are going to save this country. God bless you all. And thank you, Tom.
Mark, thank you, brother.
All right. God bless you.